there is a kind of closeness that can be developed with members of an orchestra, a love affair in which you and a body are breathing together, pulsing together, lifting and sinking together. I'm perhaps making this sound too lurid or too sexual. It is sort of sexual, but it's with 100 people. I mean, if you are pulsing and breathing and vibrating together in the extraordinarily microscopic terms of a score, a studied score, a score revealed to you, re-revealing it to them, they re-revealing it to me back and to an audience, I guess the closest analogy is some kind of sexual experience.
In a conducting career spanning more than 40 years, Leonard Bernstein has worked with most of the world's great orchestras. 3 orchestras have been particularly close to him: the Vienna Philharmonic for the past 20 years, the Israel Philharmonic for the past 40 years, and the New York Philharmonic for even longer. In this program, Leonard Bernstein will talk about his special relationship with all 3 orchestras, with musical examples taken from films and video recordings and gramophone records. For Leonard Bernstein, conducting an orchestra is like being the father of a very large family.
The New York Philharmonic was my first family. Actually, it was really my second, because the Boston Symphony was my first. Since I came from Boston, it was my hometown orchestra. I had studied in the summers of 1940 and 41 at Tanglewood, the Berkshire Music Center, which was the summer home of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and at which the great Kusevitsky had inaugurated a school called the Berkshire Music Center with a conducting department and a student orchestra and the Boston Symphony serving as faculty. I became his student as part of his conducting class. And it was there that I had my first opportunities actually to conduct a student orchestra every Friday night. One piece, everybody conducted something. Naturally, my feelings of gratitude are enormous.
Leonard Bernstein graduated from Harvard in 1939, and he went on to study music at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. Fritz Reiner was in charge of his conducting studies. Bernstein's first salaried conducting job was in New York, and at Carnegie Hall, no less, with the New York Philharmonic, whose music director was Artur Rodzinski. But the young Bernstein wasn't expected to conduct. He was hired as the conductor's assistant.
My duties were to be ready at all times to take a rehearsal or, heaven forbid, a performance in case Dr. Rodzinski or one of the guest conductors, whom there were several spotted during the season, should be ill or indisposed. And therefore I had to know all the programs, attend every rehearsal, have a suit of tails hanging backstage in some locker. And the main thing about this was that within the memory of anyone connected with the Philharmonic, including Arthur Judson, who had been running it for I don't know how many years, and his assistant Bruno Zirato. No conductor had ever been sick or indisposed. And one assistant conductor after another, I came to know some of them, had grown into deeply bitter, frustrated people who had sat and waited year after year for some conductor to get sick in vain. To make the long story short, that year that I was assistant conductor, everybody got sick, including Rodzinski and every guest conductor. Now, I'm not versed in the art of voodoo. I don't know much about sticking pins into little dolls. There were rumors that my father had paid handsomely to have Bruno Walter, who was the first guest conductor of the season, phone in sick. Or that I'd put something in his coffee. I don't know, there were all kinds of things in gossip columns. I mean, in print. Just madness. But the truth of it was that indeed, on the Sunday morning preceding the Sunday afternoon concert on November 14th, 1943, which was mere minutes after I had been given this wonderful, God-blessed job, 9 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang. It was Bruno Zirato, the assistant director, informing me that Bruno Walter had the flu and that I was on at 3 o'clock that afternoon. No chance for rehearsal, nothing. It was a particularly difficult program involving Don Quixote of Strauss, which is a very long, complex work, plus other difficult, complex pieces to precede it. I was advised that Bruno Walter would be happy to receive me in his hotel suite to go over the pieces briefly, to show me where he makes a cutoff and where he doesn't, and where he gives an extra upbeat. And since the solo cello takes his time here, be sure that the tuba doesn't. I did go, and indeed he was wonderful. He couldn't have been nicer. There he sat wrapped up in blankets and so influenza'd as you've never seen. And between coughs and one thing and another, he did go through the scores in a very helpful manner. Couldn't be very long, it was about half an hour. And he gave me his blessing, and off I went. My next memory, after having left Bruno Walter, was wandering around, not knowing what to do till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I had to put on the one good suit I had because the tails hang in the back waiting, but nobody had told me about the afternoon, that there were some concerts in the afternoon. I had nothing prepared for that, so I just wore my one good suit. And of course, it happened to be a coast-to-coast broadcast as well, Sunday afternoon in those days. So it was particularly anxiety-making. But I don't really remember much except going into the Carnegie Hall drugstore where I had breakfast every day. And kindly old pharmacist was a friend of mine, and I had cup after cup of coffee, and he said, "You're looking rather nervous and drained. Were you out late last night?" "Yes, I was, but that's not all." I told him that at 3 o'clock I would have to do this thing, and that I was a bit jittery. He said, "Look," he was my friend, said, "take these two little pills. One is white, and one is, I've forgotten, green or something. Put them in your pocket, and just 5 minutes or so before you go out on stage, just pop them in your mouth, and you will be fine. One pill will quiet your nervousness, and the other will give you energy." And I said, "Are you sure?" Can you imagine this in 1943? Drugs, 1943, illicit drugs, kindly old pharmacist, but I put them in my pocket. I do remember, the last thing I remember before walking out on stage was taking these pills out of my pocket and throwing them full force across the whole length of the Carnegie Hall backstage. There isn't any, but you know what I mean. I threw as far as I could and walked out. I remember nothing from that moment until the end of the concert, when there was a lot of screaming and the audience was on its feet. And my parents and my little brother Bertie were in the box, absolutely dazed, what had happened. And all I knew is that it was apparently a big success. And the next morning, the story was carried on the front page, of all things, of the New York Times. And I was famous.
In Carnegie Hall, we resume this afternoon's New York Philharmonic Symphony Concert, sponsored by United States Rubber Company, with a performance of Richard Strauss's tone poem, Don Quixote, subtitled Fantastic Variations on a Theme of Knightly Character. Leonard Bernstein, assistant conductor of the Philharmonic Symphony, will direct.
Bernstein's first formal appointment as a conductor was with the New York City Symphony Orchestra. The players worked for the union minimum, and Bernstein worked for expenses only. But they had a great time, premiering a few works and doing valuable second performances of neglected repertoire by Hindemith, Bartok and Stravinsky. Meanwhile, Bernstein, the composer, was teaming up with Jerome Robbins, Betty Comden and Adolph Green for shows such as On the Town. He'd already written his first symphony, and his brilliance and musical versatility marked him out as America's golden boy of music. Within a year of the war's end, he was conducting in Europe. In London, he recorded the Ravel G Major Piano Concerto with the newly formed Philharmonia Orchestra. But the visit which made the most lasting impression was to Israel.
My first encounter with the Israel Philharmonic occurred at a time when its name was the Palestine Symphony Orchestra. It was called the PSO. It was an incredible encounter. We all seemed to feel with this first program that it was the beginning of a long relationship. It's one of those things we just always knew. I was invited back for 48. The next time I came back, it was Israel. I came twice in 48, in fact. I was so excited by this wonderful orchestra, the singularity of it. A unique orchestra, really, made up of concertmasters from all over. I mean, refugees from Dresden, Leipzig, Berlin, Vienna, Prague. I mean, think of it, Bucharest. All these unbelievable string players. This is a whole other kind of family relationship, as people can grow close only in an ambiente of danger. When I was there in 48, the war had broken out because naturally the day that the State of Israel was declared, they were attacked simultaneously from 6 sides. Countries armed to the teeth, which they were not. And on the day they became a nation at war. They were, and had been at war ever since. It's just one of those incredible things. Almost 40 years of being at war. They've never known what it is to be surrounded by peaceful neighbors. So there I came in 48, and the gunfire never ceased. The shelling never stopped. We went on with our rehearsals, our concerts. They were always sold out. There was never an empty seat. I remember times of, I remember an air raid siren going off in the middle of the Beethoven piano concerto that I was conducting from the piano in Rehovot. And we got to the end of the first movement. And this thing was wailing around, and I stood up and said, whoever wants to leave, please leave now before we start the slow movement. And no one stirred, and no one from the orchestra stirred. One woman carrying a little baby in the last row got up and left. That's the only movement there was in the hall. And I sat down and played what I thought was probably my swan song. So we began this unbelievable slow movement of the Beethoven First Piano Concerto. And we finished that movement, and we finished the last movement, and the house came down, and it was as though nothing had happened, except we had a very exciting performance.
The excitement spilled over into a famous concert close to the battlefield.
I played for the troops a lot, and sometimes the orchestra couldn't go or wouldn't go. I went behind lines and played for the commandos, the Palmach, in Eilat, on the shore of the Red Sea, where there was nothing standing there except a barrack. This was one of those, but this time I got 25 volunteers. We were going to play a Mozart concerto in the desert down there. And since there was no place to play it, they had fixed on an excavational dig, an archaeological dig, which was a big hole in the ground with a lot of cells. They were digging up something to do with Abraham, because that's the famous biblical spot where Abraham had stopped. Beersheba means 7 wells. He had stopped to feed his flocks at these springs. We wound up in this excavation with 5,000 young girls and boys, soldiers, who had been told about this concert by radio, and they came in jeeps and camels and I don't know what, and ringed themselves around this excavation while we played a Mozart concerto on a piano that had been set up on a rock. And my chair was on yet another rock, and these 25 or so Mozart players were seated around me in a semicircle, very rough semicircle, depending on where there was a rock that you could put a chair. Where a cellist put the point of his cello, I have no idea. What we played was one of the most extraordinary Mozart concertos. Well, I mean, I was a bit prejudiced, but the acoustics, I remember, were so extraordinary. It was just a hole in the ground. And I will never forget these 5,000 kids. The topper of this story, it's almost a moral injunction. Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, told me months later, he pinned a medal on me that Egyptian reconnaissance planes flying around that day had seen this tremendous massing of troops, 5,000 boys and girls toward Beersheba, and had gone back to Cairo and reported this. Cairo concluding, of course, that they were massing for an attack from Beersheba, not ever believing or being capable of believing that 5,000 soldiers at such a moment would come together to hear Mozart in the Sinai desert. But that's precisely what they were doing, and of course it turned out to be a diversionary tactic, unbeknownst to any of us, because the attack did come from an entirely other direction, not Beersheba. All we were doing was playing Mozart and Beersheba. I didn't mean to digress so much about the war. It was mainly to point out that this was yet another way of coming into a kinship, a family relationship with an entire orchestra in circumstances that are so fraught with danger and romance. And I mean, it was all like living a great movie or novel. And after all, if one takes a detachment of 10 players to go and play for a detachment of 700 commandos behind the lines, and you are in a kind of friendship with those 10 or 20 or sometimes the whole orchestra, which doesn't occur every day. It's not at all an everyday affair. And so I have gone back there every year. And I must say that orchestra has changed personnel very, very much over these 37 years. I mean, some of those people, I was not yet 30 when I first went there. Some of those people, however, were my age now. So a lot of them are gone, a lot of them are retired. There's much less an orchestra of immigrants than it was before. Originally it was 100% immigrants, right? Then as Israel grew and schools of music grew, Israel was able to turn out a lot of its own great people.
Keep the pulse, even in pianissimo.
Right. There's been a rather recent Russian infusion of string players. I can't get through to them in English, German, or my Russian is lamentable, so I have to try my always failing Hebrew. After I'm there for 2 weeks, I can speak fluent Hebrew, because I know the language very well. I just get so little chance to use it that I forget. It gets quite rusty. But that's another problem, the language problem, because you can say something about 15 bars before F, letter F, change that dynamic to mezzo forte because it's drowning out something, diminuendo. And then immediately there's a noise in the orchestra.
A line over the dot. Doi, pai, da. All right.
I don't believe this. This is market day. What is this? And I suddenly have to remember, it's people translating for one another what I just said. So they're people telling other people not always in Hebrew, because there's some of the new arrivals who don't speak good Hebrew yet. So there are people who have to know, let's say, Russian or whatever, in order to translate. There's always a hubbub every time you stop to make some observation. You have to take the consequences, which you have to hang up for a minute while the news is sent all over this orchestra. And it's exhausting, I can't tell you. It also makes for a great mixture of styles. As you can imagine, if you have a French first horn and an American first trumpet and a Russian first something else, and yet they come together. That's the miracle of the Israel Orchestra, that somehow they become infused with this original spirit that created them.
Brahms's First Symphony was included in the opening season of the Palestine Orchestra back in the 1930s. The Israel Philharmonic's pioneer spirit lives on in this 1972 performance, taped in Jerusalem. We'll hear the transition to the finale. By the 1950s, Leonard Bernstein had become a celebrity, his musical world expanding now to include opera. At La Scala, Milan, in 1953, he conducted Medea with Maria Callas. Earlier, he'd conducted the American premiere of Peter Grimes at Tanglewood. His career was developing in every direction. In 1954, he delivered the first of over 100 television programs about music. 2 years earlier, his opera Trouble in Tahiti was produced on NBC television. On Broadway, there was Wonderful Town, then Candide, and then West Side Story. The question was frequently asked, was he basically a composer or a classical conductor? Well, he was both, of course. And in 1958, he was appointed musical director and principal conductor of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra.
I was amazed at being asked because, as a matter of fact, I was writing, or had just written, or was just about to open with West Side Story, when the president of the New York Philharmonic, David Kaiser, came to see me and asked me if I would take this job. Strangely enough, the job meant a succession to the term of Dmitri Mitropoulos, who, again, mystically enough, had been the man who had first, many years before that, put the idea into my head that I must be a conductor. I never had this ambition or vision of myself. It wasn't until I was already out of school, out of Harvard, and looking for a job in New York. That's all I was needing, was something within the music world by which I could make a living so that I could go on composing and playing the piano and doing all the things I like to do.
But you hadn't been conducting orchestras at university when you were at Harvard?
No, only incidentally once, a little score of my own. No, it had never occurred to me to be a conductor. That seemed far too remote and glamorous a thing. But then, for my vision of a conductor was from the second balcony, the gods, as you say, looking down at this tiny little remote figure miles away on a podium called the maestro.
Who was always a foreigner, because there were virtually no American conductors with international reputations in the 30s in America. Perhaps wrongly, but it's the truth.
No, there wasn't. Or in the 40s.
You were the first American to take the job of music director of the New York Philharmonic, and the first really important conductor from America to travel the world and make lots of recordings and so on. It must have felt
And
quite
perhaps
tough.
the only American conductor whose education had been entirely in America.
But I come back to the question, why should a man who is riding an enormously popular crest of the wave, you've got West Side Story and Candide, why should you then want to throw that away? What is it about the orchestra, since this is our theme this afternoon, that
I didn't
pulled you-
throw anything away. I just added this family to my already existing real family. I had meanwhile gotten married, and I had by then 2 out of my 3 children.
And suddenly you had 102, though.
And suddenly I had 102 plus. I'd also written my serenade for violin, and I'd written the waterfront music, and I thought I could now learn to know the great works of orchestral literature really well and try and make them in a way, the best way I could, which I hoped would be something special, individual, and not fritter away energies running from one town to another. Now, that's been true up till this moment, even after the 10 or 12 years I stayed with the New York Philharmonic, which, by the way, was a longer regnum, if you want to use this word, than anyone has ever stayed, including Toscanini or anyone else.
Wasn't it up to 1,000 concerts you conducted, I believe? Or 1,000 programs?
More. At some point during my stay there, I conducted my 1,000th concert. It seems incredible.
Leonard Bernstein led the New York Philharmonic through a glamorous decade at the Lincoln Center in New York and on tour around the world, in Moscow and Japan and Venice and London. And on television, he conducted and introduced countless young people's concerts. But what did the job of music director mean in day-to-day terms?
It involved some things that I luckily didn't have to be involved in. One of the guarantees that was made to me was that I never had to attend a board meeting, for example. I did once a year out of courtesy. I would come in and tell everybody how delighted I was with the orchestra. They would tell me how delighted they were. I would ask if there were any criticisms, and if they had, they kept them to themselves, because it was just 5 minutes of friendliness, and that's all. There was never a hint of dictatorial force in making me choose one kind of program or another. I had absolutely free rein when I wanted to do an avant-garde festival covering more than 2 months, at every concert of which there was a new avant-garde piece played.
But this was
in almost every case a world premiere, including Carter and Larry Austin and Cage, and name them.
And you had, as a conductor, you had a kind of architectural role as well as a conducting role.
Yes, because I have a strong didactic streak, I guess.
Really?
And I do love to teach. More than loving to teach, I love to watch people learn. That's really the joy of it. And so I, more often than not, strung programs together to make a thematic unity of some sort. I would have a month or two of programs called The Gallic Spirit, and investigate what is French music, played all kinds of French music. I had a Handel festival in which we played works of Handel nobody even knew, like St. John's Passion, which he wrote when he was 17. Extraordinary things like that. Then I had this avant-garde thing, which would ordinarily bring down the wrath of any board of directors, because that's box office poison. In fact, it turned out to be quite the opposite. Then I had a survey of American music from the beginning. That was the first thematic thing I did.
These were your ideas?
These were all my ideas, and I was given free rein to do anything I wanted. The 12 years in which I was with them permanently, that sounds like a solecism, 12 years permanently, but you know what I mean.
When you were music
director. When I was music director, every day for 12 years, and taking them on tours around the world, in which they were compared with resident orchestras in London and Vienna and Paris and everywhere else.
Berlin.
And they were acclaimed the greatest orchestra in the world, which made my heart leap up, because they would be commended for their Mahler in Vienna and for their Ravel in France, and so on. So that, in other words, this orchestra could, at least while I was there, take on the face, the sound, the heart of the desired composer on the dime. I mean, they could change more swiftly than any orchestra. I know that other orchestras are, to one degree or another, mired in their own sound. The New York Philharmonic should be the most flexible, because the most heterogeneous. In other words, it has more Americans in it than non-Americans, right? I mean, there'll be a Polish refugee girl sitting there, but there are exceptions. Mainly now, this didn't always used to be the case, you understand. Now, mainly, they are American-born and trained, and they are able to play all the repertoire and make the sound you want. They have a very hard time doing it because not all their conductors want that. Their conductors will want either a particular sound which bespeaks themselves, himself, or a sound that bespeaks nothing, that is just an X-ray picture of the orchestra, whatever that is. And they also have this tremendous competitive problem with every orchestra in America, and nay, in the whole world, coming through New York with their best foot forward and their greatest repertoire, playing like hell on wheels. By the time they get to New York, it's all so polished and beautiful, and they get great acclamation, to say nothing of the fact that certain orchestras have subscription seasons in New York. The Philadelphia Orchestra has its subscription season. So does the Boston Symphony. There's a Brooklyn Philharmonic. There's the Chicago Orchestra that comes and has a season. And they all come with their best. Whereas the poor old New York Philharmonic has to bat it out, a new program every Thursday night, every week, a new program, competing with these finely honed and tuned and shiny programs by everybody else. And they get battered in the press. There's no question of that. There's a certain unfairness in the judging between. But when the Philharmonic has its morale and knows that it is the best orchestra in terms of this heterogeneity and this ability to switch sounds and styles, when it has this pride and it knows what it is, then it can be the greatest orchestra in the world.
Wonderful knowledge of the orchestra. I mean, that sounds idiotically condescending for somebody outside the music world, but I know from your scores that you have a very detailed knowledge of the orchestral capabilities of every instrument, which is, of course, the job of a composer, but you seem to have it exceptionally well. Does that come from study at Curtis and beyond, or does that come from working with the great orchestras around the world?
Well, it comes from both of the above, naturally. It's a combination of study and experience, but it's also, there's another element, which is the conductor's ability to hear the score he's reading and to be able to imagine the composer's intention. That's the main thing, and I think that is the main ingredient in a successful conductor, in a good conductor. A conductor who can put himself in the place of this composer writing that piece and retransfer it. Maybe I have a little advantage in that I'm a composer myself, so that I maybe I can, with more ease, substitute myself for Robert Schumann or Tchaikovsky. I don't mean to be pompous or boastful about it, but there is something true, I guess, in that. But that's what it's really about.
And that's why
And then the problem is to get whatever orchestra you are working with to deliver that sound. And that's why you say you see the markings in my scores, which are indeed very detailed. They're all geared to that end. That's the ultimate goal, is to, in study, to get the sound of that composer into my head, in marking the score, transferring the sound in my head to these 80 or 100 instruments on stage, and have them give it back to the listener. Then that is a complete operation, and only then is that a successful operation. It's a three-stage one, as you can see.